Hello, and welcome back to the Second Chapter podcast, and a huge welcome to those joining me for the first time. I'm your host, Kristin Duffy. In this episode, I'm speaking to Christina Braver. Christina studied and worked in psychology, then spent many years working in healthcare technology. But now, she is writing sex-positive, very steamy books that might challenge your idea of a romance novel, especially when you take into account that she's a practicing, lifelong Christian. Hi, Christina. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to have you on the second chapter. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for asking. So it's great to be here. I love to talk about this stuff. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, you've definitely had some interesting career changes, so we'll get into that in a minute. But first of all, we haven't talked about this before we started recording, but you're from the Midwest originally, as am I. Where are you from?
I'm actually from the southeastern United States. I'm originally from Nashville. I went to school in the Midwest. So
Okay.
I spent about a decade in and around the Midwest. Evansville, Indiana, Dayton, Ohio, Toledo, Ohio, and then a little bit of time in Illinois. So
I am familiar because I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio. So
my husband's from Northern Kentucky, like Fort Wright, just right across the river from Cincinnati. So I'm well familiar with the Cincinnati area. Yeah.
yeah, I was just like, we have that in common, sort of. My research was slightly mistaken, but yeah, my
No, that's
sister's in
okay.
Northern Kentucky. My mom's from Northern Kentucky, so definitely the same area. I'm kind of starting afresh because I've just done an MA, so I had a little pause time where I haven't been recording episodes. I feel like we've all had things that we thought that we would do. Like when we were kids, we had this sort of 2 or 3 things that were like, this is what I'm going to be when I grow up, quote unquote. Before we even start about what you have done, were there things when you were a kid that you were like, "This is what I'm gonna be when I grow up"?
Well, I wanted to be a teacher. Like in elementary school, I wanted to be a teacher. And then as I got older, I discovered music. I mean, growing up in Nashville, let
Mm.
me just give you a little hint about Nashville. It's in the water. Like everybody can sing in Nashville. Everybody can sing. It is literally in the water. So I got involved in music or play an instrument. If they can't sing, they can play an instrument. So I got involved in music, singing, and I got involved in the arts. And so then I decided I wanted to be an actress. I didn't want to be a singer. What's interesting is I sing now. I live in the Pacific Northwest and I sing now. And sometimes when people hear me sing and they'll say, wow, like, why aren't you doing this professionally? I'm like, oh, no. I grew up in Nashville. I'm fully aware of the talent that is out there. I'm not, I'm not that. So yeah, so it's a little funny, but I decided I wanted to be an actress, which I think that was probably why the teacher thing. I liked being in front of people. I'm obviously an extrovert. So, but, but then being an actress was not for me. Like the lifestyle was not for me. I loved the idea of being in plays and being on stage, but the uncertainty of it all was just not going to fit. So,
So you decided to study as a therapist.
right, psychology. Yep. So I have a master's in clinical psychology, and I was a therapist for several years. That was my first career.
So do you feel, based on what you said about being an extrovert, do you think that was something that came in handy, or was that something that was a challenge as a therapist?
No one has ever asked me that question. So let me think about that a second. I think both. I needed to be quiet and listen, but I have to be attentive. I have to be engaged, and it can't deplete me. Like the idea introvert being with people depletes them. Extrovert being with people energizes and engages them.
Mhm.
So I think ultimately being an extrovert was a strength in therapy, in being a therapist because I needed to spend a lot of time with people. Plus, I started out as a crisis intervention social worker. So that was my first job out of school. I went out into the city when the police would call and say, we have someone who is um, in danger of of hurting themselves. We need you to come and help. So I would go out. I would also go out and check on people without the police. And so going out in those situations, like you have to be pretty extroverted to go out into a tender situation like that. So I see what you're saying. I mean, we do have to spend a lot of time quietly listening. which
Yeah.
doesn't scream extrovert. But I think ultimately this skill, that being an extrovert was the right thing because of that needing to be energized with being with people.
It kind of became obvious that it wasn't really the right fit for you. Obviously, often that's why we end up changing careers. But I don't know, I've had my own experience where the sort of study of it or, the time that you're spent learning about it is amazing. And then when you actually have to do the work, it's not so great. So what was your experience? What happened there?
It was exactly that. I, in all honesty, became very jaded and mean to a certain extent. Not mean, but cold. My husband said, "This is not working for you." He was my partner. He was my partner at the time that we weren't married yet. And he said, "This is not working for you." And I was sad and I was depressed, but I was like an angry sad and angry depressed, kind of just pissed off at like why people were making the choices they were making and continuing to make them no matter what I did. That was very challenging. And it's challenging for everyone who starts out in therapy, but there are people who have the gift of working through that, who continue to do the work and go the distance, that have the right mentors, the right supervisory relationships that help them get through that. And then there's just some people that do have a gift for therapy. And I did not have that gift. So
It's funny what you say because I just read an article, I think it was yesterday, about what your therapist is thinking that they're not saying. It was like interviews with therapists, and one of them was, "Why do you just keep doing the things that we've got? Like, what? Let me help you."
what is it? The line from Jerry Maguire, like, help me help you, please. So yeah, I mean I dealt with a lot of people. I did not work very much with the worried well. I worked a lot with, I did family therapy with families of severely and persistently mentally ill adults. That was more rewarding, honestly, than working with the clients that were severely and persistently mentally ill. Most people on assistance, unable to live by themselves, or certainly unable to work, or on long-term permanent disability with their mental illness, was largely the group of folks that I worked with in the beginning and through the majority of the time that I was a therapist. Working with their families was a little bit more impactful because the parents and the families of those individuals were so hungry for, oh, if nothing more, acceptance. I didn't blame them, particularly the moms. This was 20 years ago when I was a therapist, and there was still that, well, the mom did it, the schizophrenogenic mother, and the theory that it was, all of our mental illnesses come from our mom. So I did a lot of supporting those families and letting people know that uh, that's not really what it's all about, all that stuff that they're hearing outside world. And that seemed to make a difference. And that was helpful. That was where a place that I did feel like I could make an impact. And then the last group of people that I worked with were persons living with cancer, which was just,
Oh,
as a social worker and a therapist. It was actually the highlight of my therapy career. I would have continued to do that if I could. It's a Working with people living with cancer is a hard gig to get in. It's the cream of the crop go to those places. And so I would have needed to go back to school and do some specialty work in order to really make that a career. I sort of landed I was lucky to land in a position to be able to work with those folks. I have often said when I was doing that work, nobody knows how to live than more than the people who think they're going to die.
mm,
Just all the pettiness, all the shit you have to deal with sometimes just isn't
yeah.
there. It's just not there. They don't have the time or energy or inclination. Um, Most of the time, they're super kind. Like I don't know. I can't really describe it any way better than to say nobody knows how to live better than the people who think they're going to die. Um, it's just, it was an honor and a privilege to work with that group of people.
So is that how the segue to healthcare happened because of that group of people you're working with?
Exactly. That's how I wanted to work in a hospital. So when I I worked in a hospital in Illinois working with at the cancer center. And then my husband and I were newly married, and he got a job out here in the Pacific Northwest. And so we moved out here. And he and I had already had the conversation that individual and family group therapy was not my gift. That was not my role. And so I was kind of like, I don't really know what I want to do. And he's like, well, where do you want to work? I'd like to work in an office. I'd like to work in a hospital. It was we were trying to be broad. So I decided I wanted to work in a hospital. I started applying for jobs, anything. And because I kind of loved that environment, and I stumbled into a job that did healthcare technology, so worked with hospitals. So it was kind of the best of all worlds. I worked in an office kind of situation, but then I spent a lot of time working with hospitals, and that was a great fit for a long time. That was my career, 20 years.
You said the word when you mentioned it to me that it was a fluke. And I think it's really interesting to kind of fall into a career that ends up being what is your perfect fit. Though I guess that happens to a lot of people.
It really was a fluke. Like I took the job as a temp, and they ended up, I mean, I think that temp company made them pay through the nose, but they ended up hiring me on as full time. And I remember it sort of being a process, and me thinking, of course, we all go through this, right? Me thinking, oh my gosh, am I going to be worth this trouble that the money they're paying and the trouble they're going through to hire me on as a full-time employee? Boy, I really better do this well. That imposter syndrome. But yeah, it
Yeah.
it was a great fit. I mean, it appealed to my desire to work with people, my desire to sort of keep things organized, to communicate with people. I started out in working with hospitals who were implementing the software that we were making. The tech company I was working for built software for hospitals to use. And so I worked on the implementation team. I went out and worked with the people in the hospital. And there's some different personalities for people that work in the
Mm.
hospital. There's the people who heal, who cut and heal. So there's the doctors, the nurses, the actual medical teams. That's kind of one culture. And then there's the administrative staff. And that's another culture. And being able to recognize the differences in those cultures. And the hospital structure in and of itself is also a little different from the outside world. It wasn't that long ago that there were separate cafeterias for the doctors in hospitals. Like
Mhm.
during the time that I work, there may still be hospitals out there that have separate lunchrooms for doctors than everybody else. So that's a culture. Like I'm like, oh, that's special. Let's figure out what that's about. So I used my skills of my background in psychology and my ability to sort of connect with people, read people, ask questions, try to dig deeper. I definitely use that in working with the folks that worked in the hospital. So it was a great fit.
You say that about using your former career, your former training, your skills, because I think that that's something that we all do, of course. We bring whatever we've done before, but I think that that's something that it's taking people a long time to catch up with the fact that we can have these career changes. I mean, obviously from the podcast, I'm really passionate about people changing what they want to do sometimes or going into new fields. And I just think that people haven't caught up with the fact yet that sometimes when we're a bit older or we've had other experiences, we're bringing things that people that haven't had those experiences can't bring.
No, there's a lot of stuff to respond there because I completely agree with you. My daughter is 17, and she's literally in the next 2 weeks going to hit the button on her college applications. My son is in college. He's 21. He's in college. So I'm in the thick of that whole, what am I going to do with myself? What do I want to be when I grow up? And I keep saying, like, just decide what you want to do right now. Decide what's interesting to you, and then move forward in that vein. This may not be what you do for the rest of your life. It may, but it may not be. You are, you know, barely functioning adult. I mean, you're new to this adult land. You know, how on earth would any rational person expect you to know what you're going to do with the rest of your life at this point where I'm not sure if you can run the back. In my opinion, it's a ridiculous expectation to say that, oh, I'm going to decide what I want to do for the rest of my life. And most people, if you're interested in that thing, that's what's going to shine through, and that you're going to do the work outside of the education. There was a big change for me when I got out of my undergrad, I worked for a year before I went to get my master's degree. And my first job out of undergrad, and it wasn't going very well in the first couple of weeks. So I'm talking to my father, and I'm like, Dad, why is this not working? And he's like, Hey, work is a four-letter word for a reason. You're not supposed to like it. They're paying you to do something. If you don't like it, so what? They don't care. Like, and it was just such an eye-opening, as I came from this student experience and now I'm in this work experience where, yeah, they don't care. They just care if they're paying me to deliver and they just care if I deliver. I mean, sure, they'd like
Right.
me to be happy and skip to work and all that, but they're not going to worry about it if I'm not. So that was a big transition. And what I think is that we have this educational world, this idea, this idealistic world. Once we make that change to professional world, we continue to learn. It's just a different way of learning. And I think there's a lot of different jobs and a lot of employers that recognize that they'll say, okay, we're glad that you have this education, but what we really want to know is, are you passionate about this work? Can you deliver this work? Are you committed to this work? Can we depend on you? All of those kinds of things are things that you can't learn in college that are very important in the work world and make it possible to change careers and to move around because you're bringing that consistency of you as a professional with you everywhere you go.
I was thinking about the fact that you took classes as part of your next career, the career that you're in now. But I
Yeah.
feel like a lot of what you just said is not necessarily 100% relevant when it comes to the creative world. Because, I mean, yes, if you go work for an employer, there is a very specific, you know, like you said, you have to deliver. But when it comes to the creative world, you have to deliver in a very different kind of way, I suppose. So, with that segue, let's talk about what you're doing now.
What I do now is I write steamy romance novels and I love it. I did have to take some classes to get into it, but I think backing up further from that, I remember my background is psychology. I love to study psychology. I love to get to know people, working with the people in the hospital, working with the implementation teams, getting to know those people and understanding, okay, what's what's your pain point and how can I help you fix that? And understanding people's wounds, their pain points, and what can be done to fix that is a big part of psychology and therapy and working with anybody, and understanding people's wounds and how they impact their lives later and what can be done to impact that is a huge part of writing fiction.
Mm,
Every fiction book that's character driven, the author has done that work. If they're worth their salt, they've done that work. They've said, this is the issue, this is the wound or the pain that this person experienced. This is how it's impacting them as an adult. And the plot of the book is helping them, their growth arc is helping them resolve that wound or that conflict. Many conflicts that we have, I mean, say what you will about Freud, he got a few things right, maybe not in all the ways that we wanted, but sex and sexuality is a huge part of who we are as humans. So our wounds, they may impact us in our relationships that are platonic, but they definitely can impact us in our relationships that are romantic and sexual. That's just, that shouldn't surprise anyone, that statement. And so writing steamy romance absolutely feeds into everything that I've done. My career looks like it's kind of all over the place, but if you look at the thread that's been through it all, that's the thread.
I completely understand that because I feel like recently someone has said to me, "Oh, part of the issue you might be having is that you haven't decided what you want to do yet." And I'm like, "I absolutely have. There's a common thread through everything I'm doing right now, and it's about storytelling. Whether it's sitting here on the podcast and being able to interview people and hear their stories. I'm a filmmaker. I want to tell those stories. I'm working in theater, and whether it's as a director, producer, uh, I'm a triathlon coach, but that's still learning about people's stories and how it affects their fitness and how it affects their mental health. And I just think, again, it goes back to what we were saying before, like having that experience, and there is a through line, even if it's not always obvious.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think it takes us a while, like what you were saying before, someone who's older and had experiences. can bring something to a new space, to a new career, I think that's what it is. It takes us a while to understand what our thread is, to figure it out. Like it's not always obvious in front of us. And it takes us a while to figure that out for ourselves. And I can look back and say, oh yeah, that's the thread that's brought me here.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you'd asked me 20 years ago, if you'd said 20 years ago, you're going to be a creative writer, you're going to write romance novels, that's going to be your third career, I would have been like, that's funny. You're hilarious. Moving on. Like, I would have maybe tried to find out what delusion they had and did they like to make up stories about other people and what was that about? I would just have probably really gotten into it because that just was the furthest thing from my mind. I've never wanted to be a writer.
We've also discussed the fact that you were enjoying a 20-year career that you really did feel at home in. And of course, it was the big bad pandemic that kind of that that thing that you would have laughed about before led you in that direction. And once again, your husband was really good at kind of reflecting what you were giving at that moment.
Absolutely. As I mentioned, I have two kids and teenagers are hard. So even two psychologists, my husband has a PhD in psychology. So even two people trained with graduate level education in psychology struggle with parenting. So if you're feeling like you're struggling in parenting, everybody is. So we were struggling a little bit with parenting and our kids had some challenges and my husband's job puts the roof over our heads and food on the table. So I was the one when it was decided that we needed a parent to spend more time at home. That was me. So I actually went to part time about 5 or 6 years before the pandemic. So then when I got laid off with the pandemic, the idea of going back to work full time was not feasible. And my husband, lovely, said, look, if we can't live on what I make, then we're doing it wrong. So I think you just need to just stay home. Like this is where we need to be. And I said, that's great. I agree. What am I going to do with myself? Because I'm already helicoptering my kids into like neuroses. So I really need to stop that. So what am I going to do to prevent that? And he said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to sit around and read romance novels all day because that was like that was such an escapist thing for me. They have happy endings, everything, they're kind of sexy and lusty. The ones that I read are at least, and that's kind of exciting. And I'll just want to sit around and read romance novels all day. And he said, well, you're a good writer. You know how to write. You're a good writer. You've read a million of these things. Why don't you write one? And I said, okay. So I did, and I just fell in love. I mean, again, like a fluke. I've been super lucky that I kind of loved it. I started taking classes and started writing, and I found a writing group that I belong to now. I found an editor, a freelance editor who's very similar to me and very supportive of my work. And it, yeah, it just all sort of fell into place. And so I started writing full time. And my husband says I've worked harder on this career than any other career I've had. And I think he's right because I'm constantly, almost constantly working on it. If I'm listening to a book, it's probably related to what I'm writing. I'm writing. If I'm blogging on Medium, it's usually related to the topics that I'm writing about. It's all connected. So I do work a lot of hours, much more than I ever did on any other career, for sure.
You kind of have used the word steamy a few times. You've used sex positivity a couple of times. But I would say, having read some of your work, that steamy to me almost is like pearl clutching, like, oh, it's steamy. Whereas I would definitely describe your books as more sex positive in the sense that, like, they're fiery. It's not like you're like, oh, his member. I mean, you're like, you're
His,
getting
his,
down to it.
his quivering member opened my flower in such a beautiful way. No, no,
No.
that is not how people talk about it. I mean, I don't think so. I don't talk about it that way. None of the people I've ever slept with talk about it that way. So, based on my personal experience, I really don't think that's how it's happening. Um, so no, I don't say all that stuff. I do. I use the words and I get into it. What I think is interesting, I love to talk about romance novels and sex positivity for so many reasons. But one of the reasons that I write Steamy is I I read a lot of books by sex therapists and always have. My husband and I both do. And I encourage couples to read books by sex therapists together, talk about what you're reading. It has definitely improved our relationship and definitely improved our sex life. We've been married for 26 years. We're both in our mid 50s. According to culture, we're not supposed to have sex anymore. We're certainly not supposed to want to. That is not the case in our house. I'll be very open
Good.
about that.
Good for you. Congratulations. I'm
Right,
glad to hear it.
right. Yes, there is sex after 40, 50, 60, and we can talk about that more in a minute. But so I was reading all these books by sex therapists, and then my background with wounds, I said, oh, these are some issues, and this person has. There was a character that felt this way and had this issue, and there's a character that felt this way and had this issue, and then those two characters got into a relationship together and started having sex. What would that be like? And so that's essentially why I write steamy romance. I mean, I started writing romance because I love romance, but I just couldn't, as I was thinking about my characters and trying to figure out what I wanted them to do, I I couldn't stay away from the steamy side. I know that there are people that are not comfortable reading explicit scenes, and I understand that. And there are people who don't write explicit because they're not comfortable writing it, and I understand that as well. But my characters, they could not go behind the bedroom door and not and have sex and then come back out and she's brushing her hair and nothing changed in the relationship in the 20 minutes to 3 hours that they were behind the bedroom door. Like not my character. That's not my characters. That's not the life they live and that's not the sex they have. So I needed to be in the room with them. I needed them to tell us what was going on. And um, the first book that I wrote, it's called Your Two Lips, and she suffers from severe endometriosis and had to have hysterectomy at 25, which you find out in the first chapter. I'm not spoiling anything. And she decides, well, I can't have this particular kind of life, but endometriosis causes very painful sex. And so a lot of women who suffer, 6 million women in the United States suffer from endometriosis, and we don't talk about it. But it causes very painful sex for those women. And so they often have limited sexual experiences and certainly limited sexual pleasure. So once they're free of the disease, they're able to accomplish that, experiencing sex is almost like a new thing for them. So that's where she is. She's like, I can't have this life, but I'm going to have the greatest sex life ever. So then she meets a man who thinks he's got this whole sex thing down, been kind of a player for a while. So he's like, I don't want a relationship. I've been wounded and we're just going to be friends. But then of course the attraction overwhelms them as you would expect in a romance novel. But what's interesting is when they get together, it's not all easy. We don't talk about endometriosis. He doesn't know anything about it. But he's coming into this situation a little bit blindsided. She doesn't know anything about it because she's had this sex has always been painful for her.
Mm-hmm.
So the first time they have sexual contact is adventurous, but then they decide they're going to have sex. They're going to do the full intercourse deed. And I wrote that scene, and one of my beta readers, which is the people who read the book right after it's finished, they're the first people to read it that say these characters don't make sense. They're kind of looking for some broad problems. One of my beta readers said, there's a lot of talking in the bedroom. And I said, well, that's on purpose. Like they have to sort of talk about what's working, what's not working. He needs to check in with her. Does this hurt? Because she kind of said, well, sex has been painful for me. Talk about different positions, because the missionary position is often considered to be the most painful position for women with endometriosis.
Mm.
Doggy style or penetration from behind is often considered the least painful. Anal sex, also sometimes considered the least painful because you're not actually fully in the area. Those things are kind of surprising to people who don't know about endometriosis or having sex with someone who has struggled with it. So they have to have those conversations about, these are the positions I like, these are the positions I don't like. It's because it's not easy. Like a lot of romance novels get bad press because they fall into bed and everything works perfectly and magically, and he pumps 3 times and she comes, and it's like that, which is complete fabrication. That does not happen. That is fantasy. So, you know, so I get it. I get your frustration with this idea that that's what happens in some sex scenes in romance novels. But the romance genre has changed and evolved quite a bit lately. And that's just not the romance novels that you're going to find now. The more contemporary novels, the novels that have been written in the last, definitely the ones written in since 2020, you're going to find a lot more diversity and authenticity in those books.
It does seem like you write for, or your characters, you're definitely exploring, maybe again because of your psychology background, but you're exploring different ages, different ethnicities. It's not just about like, here is, well, you mentioned this one character. She has so much more complexity in the sense that, she does have
Mhm.
endometriosis and these kind of things, which I think is an interesting change that I think is happening more as well.
I think you're right. So, basic kind of what happened in the romance genre. So, in the early aughts, 2000, 2000s, as late as 2010, a big change happened in books in general, and that is that e-readers hit the scene. So now anybody could read anything they wanted to, anywhere they wanted to, and nobody knew what they were reading. So you can sit
Yes.
on the bus and read the steamiest, erotic, raunchiest romance novel in the world, and no one would know what you were reading. You could sit at the coffee shop and read it. You could sit in the church parking lot and read it, and nobody would know. So it opened up this genre. It opened up the genre to a lot broader audience of readers, particularly romance. Studies show that romance was really elevated because of e-readers. Statistics show. Then in late 2019, there was a huge scandal in the largest romance writing group, certainly in the United States. That was called Romance Writers of America, and they were embroiled in a very intense scandal over racism. And
Mm.
you know, reports showed that there was a lot of discrimination against marginalized voices. There was a lot of publishers that were also pulled into the scandal, traditional publishers, big name publishers. Stories said that editors from those publishers told them that people didn't want to read a book about a black woman. They didn't want to read a book about a black woman and a white man. They didn't want to read a book about someone who was neurodivergent, who had autism, or they didn't want to read those books. That's not sexy. They only want to read books about pretty heterosexual white people, and so that's what got published. That was sort of the overarching idea that came out of that scandal. And so because of that, a lot of people left traditional publishers and started to self-publish, and started the population started to call for books with much more diversity in them. So now you had sexual trauma survivors writing a romance novel where the heroine suffered from sexual trauma and then worked through and recovered from that in a much more authentic way that was not insulting or offensive to people who might have also had that experience. The idea that you would write about sexual trauma and then she just got over it because of a passionate lover is insulting to
Right.
people who've experienced sexual trauma, right? So you had much more authenticity and diversity being written about in a variety of ways, just about any way that you can imagine. So that's when books really started to make people think a little bit more. But romance novels before that served a great purpose, and that is sexual fantasy. And
Mm.
I wrote an article about sexual fantasy and romance novels, and our brains think that when we're reading something, part of our brain lights up the same way that if we're actually doing it. So it's an opportunity for us to explore and experience things in a safer way. But then people read, so for example, so many people love 50 Shades of Grey, right? I mean, or if they would never admit that they loved it, but they certainly read it all the way through. 163 million copies sold worldwide to date. Cannot lie. So, and people are like, oh, I must have a hang up. I must what BDSM. I must want to be tied up. And that's not at all the case. That book in particular dealt with several kinds of fantasies. Enjoying reading a book about someone who's being tied up could mean that you're interested in power plays and sexual power dynamics. But it could also mean that you just want to let go of all your responsibilities and be completely taken care of during sex. That could be your fantasy. People who grew up in a culture of sexual shame often have a hard time moving past that shame into sexual pleasure once they're once they're married or in a committed relationship. And some therapists have shown that after, discussing with their partner boundaries and giving consent, being tied up so that they must enjoy it or they can't resist, oftentimes allows those people to open up and enjoy the sex. So, there's a lot to be said about sexual fantasy and what that tells us about ourselves. So all those books that do have the three pumps and she comes, that are completely unrealistic. If you're getting turned on by those books, maybe ask yourself what might be going on, what's turning you on, what aspect of that book is intriguing to you or interesting to you. So they still are lovely books. No shame to those books or that trope. Just that nowadays romance is so much bigger and better. I think, in my opinion.
And yet the rule is still, or I think for people to be satisfied with a romance, and something that you proudly say, as I had to look at what HEA, but of course, happily ever after.
Yes, I'm
I
so
know that
sorry.
the
I do
very
that
few
all the
times
time.
I was like, what is that? But I was like, oh, that's a sexual position I haven't heard of. Happily ever after. And I know that, there have been a few films where they've tried to subvert that, and nobody's happy watching a boy meets girl or a, boy meets boy, whatever that is, without the happy ending. So yeah, tell me about that in your own writing, I guess, because you say that that's an absolute must.
It's a requirement of the genre. So there's lots of conversation about does Nicholas Sparks write romance? And in my humble opinion, no, he does not. He writes women's fiction with romantic
Tragedy.
elements. It is because people die in the end, which is typically not the happy ending we're looking for. Most of the time, what you want is to not be crying at the end of the movie because you're so sad that their love story had to die this way, right? So I would argue that no, Nicholas Sparks is not a romance writer. He writes romantic elements very, very well, very, very passionately. It's the only requirement of the romance genre, and that is that the couple either has a happily ever after or what we call a happily for now. So for a long, in the beginning, the happily ever after was marriage and she's pregnant. That whatever situation they're in right now, that's the situation that they're going to be in forever and it's going to be happy forever. But it doesn't necessarily have a specific definition of they got married, they bought a house, they had 2.2 kids and lived happily ever after. That's not always how it's cleaned up, or that's not always how things end up. There's plenty of happy endings that don't look like that. I'm promoting the idea that, people should read romance to get a better idea of what good sex can look like. Which could be, I've said that to some people. It's funny, I had a book signing this past week and the audience was not my audience, which was fine. But I clearly have a sign that says I write steamy romance. People come up to my table and I say, oh, do you read romance? Oh, no, no. Like they ate something sour. Like, I'm sitting right here. Like this is what I'm seeing your face right now. I just want to tell people like, what is up with that? One poor soul. I was getting pretty punchy by the end of the morning, and he said, "I said, do you read romance?" And he said, "Oh, no, no." And I said, "Oh well, you don't like sex, I guess. That's okay. It's not for everybody." He just kind of looked at me. Oh, you don't like sex. Well, that's okay. It's not for everybody. I'm really trying to promote the idea that romance is an avenue, particularly modern contemporary romances. Those that are written more recently are going to have diverse characters, are going to give you not just fantastical sex lives, but also people who are dealing with real stuff. And I think it can be an avenue for education, not the only avenue for education by any stretch, but it is an avenue for education. It can make a difference, maybe the difference in a couple that sort of lost the spark. So I think romance can make your sex life better.
I think that makes sense. In the same way that you were saying reading sex books as a couple or
Right.
individually, so you have more understandings of
Mhm.
what you want, what might be going wrong, all those kind of things is a really interesting idea. I'm not the first person to talk about this. I know you said you've talked about this before, but I do have to say you're the first person who's been on my podcast who both identifies as a Christian and has talked to me about BDSM and anal sex.
How interesting. I find that so surprising. Yeah, no, I am a lifelong Christian, pretty devout, I guess you could say. I'm Protestant. I have one of the more prominent lay leader positions in my current congregation. I speak with my pastor on the regular about lots of things, but one of the things that we also talk about is what I do and the work that I do, the things that I write. And I think what's interesting is people do either really truly believe it or they don't want to admit that sex and God are mutually exclusive. And I think, and that is, I could talk for, it's a different podcast to talk about where that came from. There's a lot of books about it. There's a lot of research, a lot of information out there, patriarchy, all of that stuff that comes into how we interpret what we read in the Bible. But if we kind of take some of those blinders off and look at some things that are written in the Bible, we can get a little bit more insight. And we find that sex and the Bible and God are not mutually exclusive. As an example, in the Bible, in Galatians, Paul writes, he talks about all the fruits, the gifts and fruits of the Spirit. One of them is love. And he says, against these, there is no law. Against love, there is no law. So laws and rules that tell us that who we love and how we love is wrong, that's not biblically based. In Genesis, it's written that God created us male and female, but a lot of people interpret that as male or female. But that's not actually what's written in the Bible. The Bible writes that we are male and female. I am a woman and I have brown hair. I am both of those things. I am not a woman or I have brown hair. We've been taught to read that in a certain way that's not actually what's written in the scripture, but because we've been taught to interpret it a certain way, then we use that to go forward and make other decisions that end up sometimes hurting people quite deeply. So if we step back from some of the things that we're taught by the patriarchy or by history or by our parents or our church, if we step back from that and look at really the Bible, Jesus' teachings, finding consistency with love and togetherness and acceptance is all over the Bible. It's all over the Bible. The thing that I say a lot of times, I grew up in the Southeastern United States. I came of age in the 80s, so it was before purity culture. And purity culture is the movement that became very popular in the 90s. You may remember like purity rings and purity pledges, and it was all about not having sex until you were married, right? And there are some people that this really resonated with in a positive way. Part of the message with the sex was very special and it should be treated as a special thing. And that is absolutely true. And I'm totally on board with that. But there were other components that were taught that were, in my opinion, really damaging. And therapists are finding people coming into therapy now that were very damaged by that message they received from the church. Messages like boys are God ordained to want sex and girls are God ordained not to want sex. So it's the girl's responsibility to put the brakes on. It's the girl's responsibility to maintain the purity of the couple. So if a couple has sex, it's not the boy's fault. He couldn't control it. God made him that way. He didn't make you that way. You were the one that had to control it, girl. However, if you look at some science information, the clitoris, the only purpose of the clitoris in women is pleasure, sexual pleasure. It's not used for anything else. Why would our creator give us an organ, give us this great gift and not expect us to use it? So the idea that women were God ordained to not enjoy sex just doesn't hold water when you look at the facts. It's a super nifty, handy thing if you're a guy, because then you don't have to take responsibility for that potential sin, right? But you had all these women who are just as interested in sex as boys are, who are feeling guilty about those feelings, are feeling responsible, feeling shunned. Some people report to the point of suicidal ideation because they felt so unworthy and unloved by God. So this is information that's coming from the church about sex to people that is not okay. And so a big part of and I could go on about that too, because I grew up before the purity culture movement, but I definitely grew up with the idea that it was my job to keep my legs closed, and that no one would want to marry me if I wasn't a virgin.
My
And a
grandfather
lot of
used to say, "Why buy the cow when you can get the milk for free?"
sure, and
Oh,
I love that expression. Let's unpack that. Let's unpack that a little bit. What are we telling girls about their value?
they're cows. They're
They're
livestock.
cows. The only reason anyone would marry you is to have sex with you. The only
Yeah.
thing important about you is your ability to have sex. There's no other value. No one would see anything valuable, attractive, lovely, worthy in you. It's just having sex with you. And what are we telling to our boys? The only thing that you want, the only reason you would ever want to marry a woman is to have sex with her. If you can have
Mm.
sex with her outside of marriage, why would you do that? I mean, what message does that send to men about what marriage is, what women are valued for? I mean, like, this is not men. Men are not the only ones. I don't know if a man ever said that to me. It was always the women around me that said, "If why buy the cow if you can get the milk for free?" I was like, "Oh my God, we're doing this to ourselves as women. We're doing this to ourselves." Yeah, I think there's been so much harm done in the name of God and in the name of faith, in not just in sex, but in lots of ways to diverse people, the oppressed. One of the key themes throughout the Bible, both Old Testament and New Testament, is that God is on the side of the oppressed. That is the whole, the Old Testament, the main theme through there is that God is on the side of the oppressed people. Who did Jesus in the New Testament spend time with? The oppressed.
I mean, I bring it up because I feel like, I'm not religious, but I see religion being used so harmfully, like you say. And just speaking to you, it's so nice to hear someone who is very open about sex and about other cultures and about other people and just the things that I feel like people are doing in the name of Christianity at the moment that are horrible. And yeah, it's nice to see the other side. And it's nice to hear you
Good.
kind of unpacking some of the biblical things as well and just being like, wait a minute, this has been used against us for so long, because I do feel like there's so much about the patriarchy that we still are fighting against, and people will continue to find, oh, but in the Bible it says this, or my religion teaches this, whatever your religion is. It's nice to hear a different interpretation and to see a different side, because I just feel the world is way too divisive and hateful, and you've got your love shirt on for people who are listening to this and not seeing the video, and you've got your rainbow and trans flag behind you, and but you also are wearing your cross, and it's so refreshing to see that can all exist together.
It does exist together. And I think if we look at the teachings of Jesus, it should exist together. Jesus was not about power. He was not about control. He didn't rise to power so he could make people do the right thing. He respected their freedom and their choices, and he encouraged them to follow him and to know him and to do the right thing on their own. But rising to power and controlling what people do was not what Jesus did. He fought against the Roman Empire, who were oppressing and controlling. Honestly, I don't know why. I I haven't maybe I haven't thought about it enough, but I don't know. I don't know how people can say that they believe that they follow Jesus and follow his teachings, and then do things that are so opposite. This stuff gets me hot and bothered and stirred up. And so, yeah, so I definitely write about it. I have a book, my fourth book in my series is called Your Turn, and the heroine is a sexual shame culture survivor. And so, writing that book was a big catharsis for me, because I either specifically or subliminally attack some of those things that I see as so offensive and um, difficult and maybe wrong, that are happening in the name of Jesus, that are hurting people and harming people. And I kind of call those things out. So that was a big catharsis book for me. Love it or hate it. So I'm sure there's probably people out there that would hate it and be like, this person's going to burn in hell who wrote this. And that's okay. I'm okay with them thinking they're on a journey. They're on a journey.
When I asked for a quote, I know you sent a quote that also mentioned God. So could you share your quote now since we're kind of on the topic already?
Absolutely. So my quote is, and this is, I read this in, I do a daily devotion, obviously every day. And this was a couple of years ago. And it says, whether God uses what I write to speak just to me or to speak through me to someone else, those words accomplish what God intends. As a writer, as a romance writer, struggling with what success looks like, I'm not selling millions of books. I'm, I'm not Colleen Hoover. And that's a very difficult thing to be. It's like being a rock star. Like I can sing, but I'm not a rock star. And sometimes you hear people make you think that everybody else is a rock star, that you're the only one that's not rock star in it. And it can feel, call it imposter syndrome. You can feel like failure, like what you're doing is a waste of time and effort and energy. And that's the place a little bit of and I go back and forth from that place, but I was definitely in that place when I read that. I keep it on my desk. What that quote really helps ground me to know that if one person is healed or helped by the words that I write or the words that I say on these podcasts, then that's worth it. You know, you saying that it was helpful for you to hear and see someone who is a Christian, but also supports LGBTQ and women's rights and believes in love and believes in diversity and has, but still knows about the Bible. That's that's the greatest compliment that someone could give me. That's so important. That what I'm doing is making a positive impact, and that I can't, as a Christian, that is what I feel I'm called to do. So not everybody can stand up and say, "Yep, I'm a unicorn. I'm a little different than what you might think." But I'm not the only one. I'm just the one that's talking the loudest. There's a lot involved there that have made this road open up to me as a possibility. And the only reason that I can believe that that's happening is because there are people that God is going to reach through my words or through my books. And so I got to keep writing them.
And I do think you said something to me beforehand about a very new definition of success. As an overachiever, it is hard not to be selling a million books or making millions of dollars or whatever that is. But I did want to ask you about that. And you did mention that you had the support of your husband and that was a possibility. And sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. But sometimes we have to give up something that we really firmly feel is what success is, to be able to do another career or to change our path. I know I struggle all the time with, how am I going to make enough money? How am I going to make this work? But it's just sometimes also understanding that success isn't about money. If I can eat, if I have a roof over my head, if I'm happy with what I'm doing, maybe that's the actual definition of success.
Listen, if you have a roof, you know where your next meal is coming from, you have food on your back, and you have health care, you're in the wealthiest 5% of the people in the world. You're wealthy. A lot of times, particularly in the United States, we categorize wealth differently. Because I don't have 15 cars and a helicopter, I'm not wealthy. That's not the case at all. We have to sort of open up our perspective on what wealth is. We just have to sort of look at how we define success. And I think in the United States in particular, success is defined as wealth, as financial success. And even when I started out, a lot of people were asking me, are you selling many books? And so hard for me to say, oh yeah, I sold one, I sold two, or I sold 30, which to me, that's like, but other people are like, oh, 30. So it's just how you define success. And it is something that as you change careers, you do have to sort of come to grips with that. But as we get older, if this was 20 years ago, I couldn't have made this career change. We needed both of our salaries to make the mortgage and the food and all the things that we needed. So now that I'm older and we're a little bit more established financially, it's a time when I'm able to make this change, and we aren't going to lose our house or our cars, or our lifestyle hasn't changed that much. So later in life, job changes are actually maybe a little bit easier and a little more awesome. One component I want to touch on there, being a writer, not a lot of writers make money. We just, newsflash, if you want to be a writer, awesome, but please don't quit your day job. And because of that, and so I recognize that I am white, I am a woman, I am wealthy. For in a lot of definitions, I'm wealthy. Um, I have a certain amount of privilege, and I always have. Um, I There are people in marginalized communities that cannot afford to write the books, cannot afford to do the thing. I need to do the things. And a woman, they might feel comfortable picking up my book, and it might be their only exposure to a gay relationship or an interracial relationship. Those people may have grown up in cultures that told them those things were wrong. So if they can pick up my book and learn about a little bit more about different cultures, I think that's an important thing for people in my position to do. If I can afford to write these things, I need to make sure that I'm being respectful of marginalized communities, because there are tons of important writers that just simply can't afford the time to write the book. And um, I take that very seriously. I write first person POV, so I'm in the character's head. I'm in their thinking brain. So for me to write a person of color would be a pretty arduous task, because I am not a person of color. So I would need to have a very serious and intense, what we call sensitivity reader, which is someone who can help me write that from an authentic perspective. And so I need to get to a place where I can get that and pay for that. And I'm not there yet, but that is a goal. That is something that I want to do. The short story that I wrote about the couple, I don't know if it's the Christmas short story that I wrote. That's the couple that's in the first three books, and that was only 10,000 words. And there is an actual woman that Rianne is based on, a friend of
Mm.
mine, and I had her read, Rhiannon, and I said, I can't pay you. And she's like, oh, it's only 10,000 words. And she's a friend. And, oh, no, I'd love to do it. I'm just so happy that, she's the most beautiful Black woman I've ever seen in real life. And so, which is one of the reasons that I kind of modeled Brienne after her. But to do that authentically, respectfully, pay that person for their time, because what they're giving me is valuable. And I think as writers, those of us who are privileged to do this and not have to make money. I like to see a lot of us keep that in mind, that we need to consider the marginalized voices that can't afford to write the books that really should be written. So,
As you said about another topic, I feel like this is something for a whole other podcast, but it's nice to hear you talk about that as well. Cause I do feel like there's this whole like, should stories be left to, a tell your own kind of story? And I think there's a really valid point behind that. But I do think that there is, as long as we keep that divide and act as though there's not a human condition, or refuse to, try to grasp what it is to be human from different
hmm
perspectives, I think we'll
hmm
kind of remain in, again, this sort of like siloed world. So, as you said, if it's something that's done respectfully, if it's something that there is a sensitivity reader, that we are looking at stories as a human condition, I think that's so hugely important. So, like I said, I could go on about that forever, but I think that's a really interesting debate. But I also think you seem to have fallen on the right side of the debate, where it's, I want to do it, but I would never do it the wrong way.
right. And there, I am not alone. There are so many writers like me that would love to write more diverse characters for the same reasons that I want to, but are terrified of doing it wrong. And so maybe terrified is not the right word, but definitely, um, you know, hesitant to the point of inaction for fear of doing it wrong. And hopefully we can move past some of that into some spaces of grace. We might not be there yet. And I totally understand why we might not be there yet. But yeah, just know that there's a lot of interest in doing that, but a lot of hesitation. And, for better or for worse, that's there. But yeah,
Yeah,
there's
and
just
you
one
do
us
and
that want
you
to
do
do it.
need the authentic voice, on your side, so that you are telling it the right way, and that, like you said, that's not always financially possible. So, hopefully we'll get there anyway.
I had one Black author tell me, just don't make the conflict about their race. But then I had another Black author tell me, how can an interracial couple have a relationship and never talk about race? That's not realistic either. So, and that's the point at which I was like, okay, I don't know what to write, so I'm going to take a beat. It's just, yeah, it's a tough ask, but there's interest and effort, and it will get done. It will happen. It'll just be intentional and slow.
And the levels of success will change, but it seems like now what you've defined as success is happening. So, congratulations on this career.
I mean, there's still those, I'm a type A. I grew up, my dad was like, stand on your own 2 feet, get a job, make your own money, go to college. Like it was, it was a little counterculture to what some of my friends were hearing from their fathers. So this whole idea that I don't make my own money goes down, still chokes when I go, when it goes down, it still chokes a little, but I do try to focus on, that this is the success that is important and meaningful and that I can do. And it's a blessing. It's a gift. So I'm grateful for it.
So at the beginning, I asked you 2 or 3 things that you wanted to be when you grew up. Are there any things that you still want to be? Doesn't have to be a job,
Once
but
asked, yeah, no, I was once asked what my definition of like, it's outrageous success. What would that look like to me? And I think that would look like seen at least in the United States, if not internationally, as being known for writing sex positivity well, or being known as someone who promotes sex positivity, being widely known as someone who promotes sex positivity, whatever that looks like financially, for better or for worse. But I want people to read these books. I had someone say to me at a recent book fair, your books are too inexpensive. I pay a lot more. I paid $20 for this book. And I said, well, would you pay 30 for 2 books? My books are like $15 each. And so she's like, you need to know your worth. And I said, well, I want this information to be out there. I am making some choices, but I want this information out there. So many women in particular. And as I'm reading and, on blog posts, men too, like don't have enjoyable sex lives and think that sex is over at a certain age, or have never enjoyed sex. And it's this incredible part of life that is unattainable for some people or gone for some people. And it might not have to be, it doesn't have to be. There is information and resources either in romance novels or books from sex therapists or blogs or podcasts. We are living in an information age, not porn. I'm not talking about porn. I mean, porn has a purpose, but education about healthy sex is not one of those purposes. But there's a ton of information out there about sex and sexual pleasure and making it good for people of all walks of life. And I just want people to be able to experience that for as long as they want to.
and I think that's really important. With that, I'm going to let you go, and I'm going to go have some sex. So
Excellent. Yes. You can call out my name instead of your partner's name, then that would send that up into the universe. That would be great. I'd appreciate it. Take that
that
positive
would be
energy. So,
that would be so weird, but okay.
yeah. No, don't do that. Your partner would be like, what? So
I have no problem with getting a little kinky. That's fine.
it can be liberating. It can be liberating. My favorite quote is that I'm the first person that has talked about Christianity and BDSM and anal in the same. I got to write that down. That was a proud moment for me. So I got to write that down.
Good. Good. I will make sure that's not edited out so you can have that audio clip to hear again and again and again.
Perfect.
Thank
Awesome.
you, Christina, so much. I've had such a fun time with you, and you are spreading a really positive message. And yeah, it was great to chat. Good luck with everything.
Thank you. I had a great time. Thanks for listening and thanks for sharing, and and thanks for your very kind compliment. Truly one of the kindest things that anybody could say. So thank you so much. And it was great to be here.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, tell a friend, follow us on Instagram, and sign up for the Second Chapter newsletter. The Second Chapter is brought to you by Slackline Productions, a production company dedicated to redressing the balance of women's stories being told and who's telling them, with a specific focus on women 35 plus. You can find us at thesecondchapterpodcast.com and slacklineproductions.co.uk. Thanks again.